Hello everybody, I'm Catalin Tudose. I am a Manning author. I have written the book called JUnit in Action, and I am currently preparing a new book about Java persistence. Today we are going to discuss about object-relational mapping using JPA, Hibernate and Spring Data JPA. So let's dive into these topics. First of all, to introduce to you the objectives of our session. You will find out about the fundamentals of object-relational mapping, about the basics of JPA, Hibernate and Spring Data JPA, and by the end of our session we are going to make some comparison between the work with JPA, with pure Hibernate and with Spring Data JPA. If you ask yourself if it is the right place to be, I would say definitely yes, but if you would like to check again, we would like mostly to target developers who are new to ORM, or even if you are not new to ORM, if you have some understanding of ORM and want to choose between different alternatives, it is the right place to be, because we are going to make some comparison between these alternatives. To introduce what or to remind to you what object-relational mapping is, we talk about object persistence. If we have an application and we execute it, there are many situations when we would like that the information from the objects in the memory to survive the end of the execution of that application. And this is object persistence. We would like to save the information from these objects, most likely to a database. And we have a few possibilities to do this. We can use pure SQL, stored procedures and triggers, so to address directly to the database. Or from a Java application we may use the classical JDBC API that is in use for many years in order to access databases from Java. Or we may use some ORM or object-relational mapping implementation. For example, Hibernate, which is definitely the most popular ORM implementation. And today a very hot technology is available. It is called Spring Data, and it facilitates the access to different kinds of data stores. JPA, formerly Java Persistence API, nowadays Jakarta Persistence API, is a specification. Not an implementation, but it is a specification that tells us what needs to be done and which API is available in order to persist your objects. Of course, behind the JPA specification, you need a persistence provider that will effectively implement the object-relational mapping. Hibernate, for example. But JPA has its own API, it provides it to us, and we are free to use from a few alternatives as a persistence provider. Hibernate, as a persistence provider, may be used together with the JPA API, but at the same time it has its own native proprietary API. It is an independent framework, but it also can be used together with other frameworks, for example with Spring, but also with Jakarta Enterprise Edition. And Spring Data JPA, which is a layer that comes on top of these ones. It provides some improved support for JPA-based data access layers. We are going to demonstrate that it reduces the boilerplate code, and it creates some implementations for the repository interfaces. Now that we introduced our topics, let's have a look at the code demonstration. I prepared here an application that would like to persist information using Hibernate, using JPA, and using Spring Data JPA. So let's see what it provides to us. We have a class called entity, and in order to show that it is related to a database, it is annotated with this entity annotation. This tells that it is not just a simple class, but it has some correspondent table into the database. It needs to have some identifier, some ID that corresponds to the primary key in the database, and that is why this ID field is annotated with ID, and we tell here, hey, generate this value. Who? The database should generate this value using this identity strategy. Otherwise, it provides some simple info, and for it we have here a getter and a setter. So this is our entity. It is simple, and we would like to persist it. We would like to compare our alternatives for persistence and to conclude about which are the advantages and which are the shortcomings of each of them. So what can we do with this item? We can try to persist it with JPA, and I prepared here some piece of code. It is a test that will persist this item. We are using this JPA API. In order to work with JPA, we need some persistence information or persistence metadata, and it belongs here into this persistence.xml file. What are we telling here? Among others, that our persistence provider is Hibernate. So our JPA is backed by the Hibernate implementation. And we provide here a few informations about accessing the database. I installed here on my machine the MySQL database, so I provide here information about the driver, that it is the MySQL driver. The URL of the database to be accessed is this one, just to let you know that MySQL is running on port 3306. The name of the database that I created is Twitch, and in order to access it, we provide this user and password, no password, user root and no password. We are addressing to a MySQL database, so I have to write here that the dialect is MySQL dialect. This means that whenever you will try to persist an entity, Hibernate will translate the persistence action into some insert query, for example, that will use this MySQL dialect. So you will not have to care about which database you are using. You just have to provide the correct persistence information here, and Hibernate will take care about the generation of the SQL queries. In case you would like to switch to another database, you have to change this configuration, and for the consistency and in order to demonstrate how it works, I provided here some example inside the command saying if you would like to move to H2, let's see, you have to change here the driver, the URL, user, password and dialect. And for the moment I do not show the SQL when it is generated, but whenever I will execute my queries, I will create the tables from the scratch. So this is the meta information that JPA needs in order to work with the database. What does it do? The JPA API used here will need first to create an entity manager factory. Based on it, we'll create an entity manager. It will begin a transaction, create this item, persist it, and commit the transaction. And if we would like to ask ourselves what's inside the database, did we correctly persist the information, we can address to the database using the same API. Say, hey, please create this query to select everything from item, and let's have a look at it, what's here into this items list. And in order to make sure that everything is right, I'm also asserting here that the size of the items that I retrieved from the database is 1, and the content of the item that is retrieved is correct. Let me execute this test. It says save retrieve item. It says it is correct, test is green, and if we go here and I take a look at the content of the database, I see I have this item from JPA. If we would like to see more about how things are going, I can go here and choose to show the SQL while it is generated, re-execute this, and you see that we have the possibility to inspect what Hibernate creates for us. So it creates a table because here I instructed it to create a table at each execution from scratch, and it will insert this information. So we have the possibility to inspect. Of course, the SQL is generated according to this MySQL 8 dialect. So this is the JPA API. We have the possibility to use the same item as an entity, but to save and retrieve it using the Hibernate API. In order to do this, I also need some configuration, some metadata about configuration. Things are pretty similar in concept, about the driver, about the name of the database, username and password, and some information about the pool size of connections to be maintained. Show SQL, let me commute it to true, and again I am creating the database, the table from the scratch. And if I execute this test, we see again the generated SQL, dropping the table, recreating it, inserting information, and if I go here, it was item from JPA, I re-execute it, so now I have item from Hibernate because I recreated this item using the Hibernate API. So I go back here, and you will see that it is the steps of the execution are pretty similar. First, we have to create such a session factory based on the configuration that is provided here. This hibernate.cfg.xml file is the default name of the Hibernate configuration, so it will take the configuration from there, add item as an annotated class, build some configuration, and build this session factory that is used here. Then we create the session, create the item, persist commit the transaction and create another transaction to retrieve the item from the database. Pretty similar steps and a different API. So the JPA API and the Hibernate API are having some similarities, but they are different APIs. Can we commute between Hibernate and JPA? Let's presume that we have some JPA application and we would like to commute it to Hibernate or vice versa. Yes, we have some possibilities to obtain an entity manager factory from a session factory and vice versa. And I prepared here this example. When we commute from Hibernate to JPA, meaning that we have some session, yes, we have some configuration here from Hibernate, and we would like to build an entity manager factory based on it. Here we load this configuration from this default Hibernate CFG XML file, and we take property by property, we populate these properties variable, and we pass it as an argument of this create entity manager factory. So we have a Hibernate configuration, but we use this small method and this small piece of code in order to create some entity manager factory. So we have Hibernate configuration here, and we create an entity manager factory based on the properties on this Hibernate configuration. You see, I'm retrieving here entity manager factory, and then I am able to use this entity manager factory just like if it was obtained based on a persistence.xml configuration. Let me try just to execute this. We see again the creation of the table and the insertion of the information, and if I go here and I say select all from item, I say item from Hibernate to JPA, we provided different information just to emphasize that we are doing different things. And vice versa, from JPA to Hibernate. Let me close these ones. I have here this test. I have an entity manager factory which is a JPA object, and as long as I know that it is JPA is backed by Hibernate, I can simply unwrap this session factory and to obtain from this entity manager factory this session factory. And from here, after that I unwrapped it, I can start using this session factory and the Hibernate API just like I was previously doing. Let me execute this test. Again, creating, inserting, and if I go here and I say select all from item, I will say item from JPA to Hibernate. So what I demonstrated here is the usage of the JPA API and the usage of the Hibernate API, and how to switch between them, how to unwrap a session factory from an entity manager factory, and how to build an entity manager factory from the Hibernate configuration. Otherwise, I emphasize the fact that JPA and Hibernate have some similarities into the API. You have to create some factory object, then some object from the factory, begin transaction, persist or save the object, commit the transaction, and things of this kind.